Charles from GMAT Ninja here. Welcome to our video on how to optimize your approach to GMAT Quant questions. Today, we're going to talk about both problem solving and data sufficiency and how to approach things in a nice systematic way. Now, if you're watching this, you might be expecting a nice conventional quant video where we're going to go through some geometry formulas or some algebra techniques. I want to be totally clear. This is not a math video in the way you might conventionally think of it. Instead, we're going to do something that I think is much, much more important. We're going to talk about how to make your process absolutely bulletproof, systematic, so that you're approaching questions the same way every single time. The reason that's so important on a test like the GMAT that's adaptive is that when you make careless errors on these tests, that's what can absolutely kill your score. So if you're prone to careless errors when you take the GMAT or the executive assessment, this video is absolutely for you. We're going to show you some processes that'll help you stamp out those careless errors and manage your time better. If you're sitting here going, hey, I've been studying for a while and I don't know why my quant scores aren't that great, this video is definitely for you, because we're going to talk about, again, how to give yourself some nice systematic processes, avoid that erraticness, and help you perform up to your potential. And if you're brand new to the GMAT or EA Quant, this is perfect, because what we're going to teach in the next 20 minutes, 30 minutes or so is actually more important probably than the content itself, just because it is so critical on an adaptive test to make sure that you're systematic, that you stamp out those bad test taking habits, and that you perform to your abilities and you never beat yourself on the test. All right, with that in mind, plan for today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the algorithm, why it's so important to avoid those careless errors, and why these processes and the systematicness is so absolutely critical on a test like the GMAT or the executive assessment. Then I'm going to take you through what that process actually is. I'm going to do that by showing you 4 different quant questions. I'm not trying to melt your face off with super hard math, nothing super complicated. These are all roughly mid-level questions. And again, the math itself is not going to be the point. I'm going to start you with a problem-solving question that'll help us illustrate here's what a good process looks like. I'm going to take you through a couple data sufficiency questions to kind of show what exactly I want you to do to be systematic and avoid sloppiness on data sufficiency. Then we'll finish up with one last problem-solving question that has a little bit of funkiness to it and kind of help you think flexibly as you approach GMAT and executive assessment quant questions. All right, with that in mind, let's get started. I'm not going to go super crazy being super precise with what the algorithm's doing. I'm going to oversimplify massively just to get to the punchline. If you're more interested in the algorithm, feel free to leave us a comment. We might do a more involved video that really gets into the 3-parameter logistic model in much more detail. Here's what you really need to know, though. On a test like the GMAT or executive assessment, what the test is trying to do is find the level of question at which you get half right, half wrong. So what's going to happen is that if you get a question right, you're going to see a harder question next. If you get a question wrong, you're going to see an easier question. Now, it's really, really, really easy to freak out about that stuff, but here's the bottom line. You're going to miss a ton of questions. Number one, the test is going to get harder and harder and harder if you're doing well on the test until the questions are really going to make you squeal. So you're going to miss a ton. Don't be a perfectionist when it comes to the tougher questions. What is really important is you get the ones right that are easy for you, whatever that means, depending on what your level is. I know we have people watching who are really shaky at quant. Probably some of you watching are already fantastic. Bottom line, whatever your ability level is, don't miss the questions that are easy for you. Execute really, really well. Because if you miss those questions that are easy for you, you're never going to see the ones that are tougher, and your score is going to be stuck really, really low. Very, very briefly, there's some data from an academic study by 2 of my favorite psychometricians. And yes, I'm nerdy enough to have favorite psychometricians. And they did a simulation study. And I'm going to abstract it a little bit. They weren't talking specifically about the GMAT, but it was with data that it runs exactly the same model as the GMAT. Punchline was, if you take somebody whose skill level is at the 710 level on the GMAT, so 90th percentile, and you say, okay, this person would normally get those first 2 questions right, no problem. But let's say that we tweak their data so that they miss the first 2 questions. And then after that, they behave as a 710, 90th percentile scorer scores. So behave the same way after that. Miss the first 2 questions. After that, they act like their normal 710, 90th percentile selves. What happens to their score? They lose the equivalent of about 80 points. So just by missing the first 2 questions, if you're somebody who should be scoring at the 90th percentile, you miss those first 2 on both quant and verbal, you'll lose roughly the equivalent of 80 points, going down from a 710 to a 630. And that's just with 2 careless, sloppy errors at the very beginning. So I can't emphasize this enough. It is absolutely critical that you execute well. If you're not getting the questions right that you know how to get right, doesn't matter how great you get at math, doesn't matter if you watch the rest of our quant videos and you learn everything absolutely perfectly. If you're not executing, your score is going to be stuck. So everything I'm going to tell you in the rest of this video, not sexy, not exciting, I know that, but it is literally the most important thing you can possibly do for your overall quant performance. All right, with that, let's go ahead and launch into some examples. I'm going to take you through a 4-step process. Again, nothing sexy. You're not going to enjoy hearing about it, but so important to get it right. We're going to go through that 4-step process. But first, I'm going to toss a question your way. Not super hard math. Some of you are going to miss it because you're being erratic and you're making careless errors. I don't think anyone's going to miss it because of issues with the math itself. So you might get this right, you might get this wrong, but when we come back, I'll take you through a process that I want you to do every single time, and I'll kind of show you some of the errors that people make on this particular question. Go ahead and take a couple of minutes here. All right, as always, hit that pause button if you need a little bit more time. You shouldn't on this particular question, but for everybody else, let's go ahead and let this rip. All right, I'm going to start off by talking about that general process that I was talking about in the beginning of the video. That, again, I'm going to argue is one of the most important things, if not the most important thing you do for your quant score. If you can nail this, whether you're starting off great at quant, not so great at quant, this is where all the magic is, and it's really hard to execute. It's going to sound really dumb, and it's really hard to execute, but again, 80% of the battle for most of our students is mastering this, put it into practice 100% of the time. Not 91%, not 93% or 77%, 100% of the time. Nothing sexy here. Read the question twice, every single time. Why is that so important? The way GMAT questions are often written, you misread one little modifier and you're in real trouble. And part of why I picked this question, again, math is super simple here, but part of why I picked this question, lots of opportunities to misread, misinterpret, decide that you've seen something that you haven't. And so if you miss some little piece of it, that these are 2-digit integers, for example, or you misread the direction of these signs closest to all these little bits, you misread something like that, you're in real trouble. It doesn't take you that long to reread it. Do that every single time, no exceptions. One of the things I'll often ask a student to do if they have a real problem with this and they systematically misread questions is I'll say, sit on your hands. You finish one question, sit on your hands so you're not tempted to start writing stuff. Read the question a couple times. Give yourself a moment to digest. Make sure you notice all of those little details that are going to matter in a quant question. Step number 2, this is the one a lot of people skip. Might be the most important one. Plot your path forward before you jump in. Typical GMAT question, and again, this one's a little bit simpler than most. Typical GMAT question, there's going to be 5 or 6 different ways to approach it. Typical mid-level question, maybe, might have 5 or 6 different solution paths. They're testing you on whether you can find the best path forward, the most efficient path forward. Give yourself a moment, take a breath, spend 15 or 20 seconds to try to find the best way forward. If you do the first thing that comes to mind, I guarantee you're going to waste a ton of time. You're going to run behind, and then you're going to end up scrambling, and you're going to make more careless errors because you've picked suboptimal paths. Now, look, you're not going to pick the perfect path on all 31 of your quant questions on the GMAT. Or on all 14 of your EA questions. It's just not going to happen. It's hard to do, but you need to give yourself the best shot of doing that. Make sure you breathe, think about your options. And just as importantly, be honest with yourself. If you see a path forward and it's garbage and you go, hey, wait a minute, I'm going to do 12 lines of algebra here. Maybe that's your cue to walk away. Guess, move on. If you're taking the executive assessment, you can come back to it. If you're taking the GMAT, hey, look, you're going to miss 40 or 50% of the questions anyway. That's one of those questions that you should just skip, answer, guess something, move on, and say, good job, GMAT, you got me right there. So step 1, read twice. Step 2, plot your path forward. See if you can find a better path. Don't do the first thing that comes to mind. And just as importantly, if you don't see a good way forward, guess, move on. Again, executive assessment, you can always come back to it. Step 3 also sounds really obvious. My students are tired of hearing this, but I can guarantee that if you're scoring beneath your potential, if your scores are all over the place on GMAT Quant, you're probably not doing this as often as you should. Check your work as you go. Sometimes 4 times 7 is 32. It just is. Doesn't matter who you are. Sometimes 6 times 8 is 56. We all make those mistakes. We're human. Now, the key is every time you write something down, you write down that line of algebra, you do that little piece of arithmetic, you draw that angle into your geometry figure, whatever it might be, check it. Give yourself a few seconds and just go, sanity check. Is this right? Is this in the right ballpark? Okay, is 4 times 7 really 32? Hey, wait a minute. No, it's not today. So take that step. Doesn't take you very long, and it's going to save you a lot of trouble. It's going to save you a lot of time too. You're much better off catching it as you go through than getting to the end and going, wait a minute, my answer's not there. Crap, what did I do? And they have to redo the whole problem. This builds efficiency. And again, it's also absolutely critical for avoiding those score-killing, careless errors. Step 4, another one that's not a crowd pleaser, read the question one more time. And this is where I always get, hey, Charles, I don't have time to read the question 3 times. Yeah, you do. It doesn't take that long on Quant. Just do it every single time on Quant. Get in the habit. Now, I'm not saying go brain dead and just read it for the sake of it, but there are so many reasons why this 5 seconds, 10 seconds can really save your butt. Number 1, it's your last chance to see those little modifiers that might totally change the question. Number 2, one of the mistakes I see over and over and over, answering the wrong question. So one of the first questions I love to give our students when they're just starting out with tutoring, it's a question that asks for the retail price of a certain item that went up by some percentage, and almost without fail, they give me the wholesale price. That's one of the wrong answers. So really, really easy to make that mistake. You solve for some variable. The question's asking you for something a little bit different. They're asking you for x squared. You solved for x. Really easy to make that error. Number 3, maybe most importantly, as you're reading one more time, I want you engaged. I want you thinking about the kinds of mistakes that you personally make. So I call that using your human brain and just going, hey, can I ballpark this? Does my answer seem reasonable? Is there something I recognize here where I've had trouble in the past? So don't just read and be brain dead and just skim over the words. I want you to be thinking, okay, anything I should be watching out for? It's your one last check to make sure you didn't do something goofy. We all do goofy things. Got a perfect 800 on the GMAT. I do goofy things all the time. You're going to see me do it in the videos sometimes. The key is I catch it. I practice what I preach. I do exactly this every single time, no matter what your level is on Quant. I want you doing these 4 steps every single time. Once again, I hate being that teacher that's like, master my techniques and you're going to succeed. Watch the rest of our Quant videos. I'm going to tell you that you don't need the 7th question or probability video to get a great score on the GMAT. I say that straight out. This is one of those few things. You do this every single time. You do it religiously. You do it with full energy. You do it efficiently. You're going to see a boost in your score. If you're seeing a lot of movement in your scores, you're going to see it go away if you can do this every single time. Okay, not sexy. I know nobody wants to hear all that stuff. Now you've heard it. Let's put it into practice. Again, the math here, that's not the point. Not a big deal on this question. If A and B are 2-digit integers such that A is greater than 60 and B is less than 80, which of the following is closest to the maximum possible value of AB? I like this question just because it's so easy to misread. If I've written those answer choices well enough, a lot of you are going to fall into one of them off of a misread. 2-digit integers. Okay, so A is greater than 60. So if A is greater than 60 and it's a 2-digit integer, the maximum value of A is going to be 99. What about B? Maximum value of B. B is less than 80. Is going to be 79. And we can kind of say, hey, I'm going to plot my path forward here before I do anything. Am I just going to multiply blindly? Not a chance. Closest to, look at these nice round numbers. I'm going to take a breath if I start barreling through. I'm not going to waste a ton of time, but I might waste a little bit of time multiplying out a couple 2-digit numbers. I don't need to. Close enough to 100, close enough to 80, multiply those guys together, we get D and we're done. And again, fairly easy to see the kinds of mistakes we see people make. Sometimes people go, okay, close to 60, close to 80, that must be 4,800. Nope, it's not, because A is greater than 60, B is less than 80. Sometimes we get people saying, well, 60 times 80 is 5,600. Sometimes we get people lopping off zeros, and sometimes people kind of misread the sign and say, well, hey, they're two-digit integers. How big can they get? One's bigger than 60, one's bigger than 80, which is not what the question says, and you get around 10,000. So all kinds of mistakes you can make on this. Hopefully you didn't make one of them. I just use it to illustrate the different things that can happen if you're not reading twice, you're not taking a breath and kind of thinking about what you're doing before you do it, and not checking your work as you go. And again, as always, just read it one more time. Cost you 7 seconds to go anything I should watch out for, any little modifiers, signs on those inequalities. Am I in the right ballpark? Okay, looks like I'm in the right ballpark. I'm good. Answer's D, 8,000. All right, next two questions are going to be data sufficiency. Once again, I'm going to leave this on the board. I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about what I want you to do in data sufficiency specifically to avoid those careless errors, maximize your efficiency. But I'll give you a question first, and then we'll talk about how to approach it. All right. If you need another moment, take it, especially if you haven't done data sufficiency before. If you need some more time to digest the instructions, hit the pause button, hit the rewind button so I'm not on your screen, maybe. All right. First, but I'm going to talk big picture for everybody, whether you're new to data sufficiency or not. Where does silly mistakes, where do those careless errors come from on data sufficiency? I'm not talking about the errors where you just don't know how to do the math itself, talking about errors where you do something and you miss a question you should be getting right, those score-killing careless errors. Two biggest things, really. One is failure to push the question enough. So they're going to give you a bunch of information in the question a lot of the time. If you're not working with that enough, it's going to cause trouble for you. I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. Second thing, arguably the more important one, I see students combine these statements all the time, kind of digest all of this all at once, get themselves into all sorts of trouble. Part of what I really like about this question is that you could make all sorts of mistakes if you're just if you're glancing at it and trying to digest it all at the same time. For example, you might have chosen C because you very, very hastily said, like, okay, well, hey, wait a minute, there's an equation here, an equation here, an equation here, 3 equations, 3 variables, boom, must be C. And if you did that, you failed to evaluate them separately. Similarly, you might have not even looked at that and said, hey, 1 equation, 2 equations, 3 variables, 2 equations, 3 variables, can't solve it. Basically, that's the same type of error. You're kind of rushing through, digesting the statements all together. Huge mistake. I want you to consider them separately. And we're going to talk through a method to do that in just a second. Okay, I'm going to leave the instructions up here on the board. I'm going to rifle through kind of a general approach here. If you've done a lot of data sufficiency before, you might have heard some of this in the past. please bear with me. I'll try to go through it fairly quickly. If you're brand new, hit the pause button if you need to, rewind if you need to. I'm going to try to please everybody by saying the basic things that everyone needs to hear at some point, but I'm going to do it fairly quickly so I don't bore the veterans here. All right. I like to use this little widget, ADBCE, popularized by Manhattan GMAT way back in the day. Don't know if they came up with it, but they brought it to the world and made it really, really popular. Nothing magical here. I just think it helps to get you in the right rhythm. Again, what I want you to do, read that question twice, do anything you can with that question. If there's a way to push it a little bit, manipulate the algebra in here, always do it. I'll illustrate that more in just a second. Then don't look at statement 2. I want you to look at statement 1 in isolation and say, all right, is this sufficient? Now, if statement 1 is sufficient, it must be either A or D. So if it's either A or D, you can cross out BCE. That's if statement 1 is sufficient. You're left with A or D. Now, if you're in the world where statement 1 is not sufficient, same logic, just the other way around. It can't be A or D. Cross those out. Now, like I said, it's not doing anything magical. I guess it's satisfying to cross out a whole row of letters no matter what. But that's your cue. What I want you to do there, take a breath, wash your brain, see if you can forget about this. Because one of the most common mistakes we see, you're taking this information with you as you look here, and you might go, oh, I've already got that equation. I've got a second equation. Maybe jump to a conclusion. So what I want you to do, you cross something out and go, okay, wash my brains, reread the question. I'm looking for M. And then I look at statement 2 in complete isolation, doing my very best to forget about statement 1. Now, again, if we're in the world where statement 1 was sufficient, then you're in business here. If this is also sufficient, your answer is D. If this is not sufficient, your answer is A. Fantastic. And now if you're in this world where statement 1 was not sufficient, you can look at statement 2 in isolation. Obviously, if this is sufficient, answer is B. If it's not, then you evaluate them together. If together they're sufficient, your answer is C. If not, it's E. All right, let's work through that with this particular question. Again, I'm not trying to melt anybody's face off with really hard math here, just basic algebra, linear equations, that's it. But I think this is a really good question where it's really easy to stumble on stuff if you're not being systematic. Read that question twice. If K minus M is equal to N, what's the value of M? My little habit here, again, not a big deal, but helps prevent those careless errors. I like if it's a question, so I'm rewriting that question as a little piece of algebra in this case. I like to kind of leave this Q and the question mark in there just as a reminder that that is not a fact. That's the question itself. They gave me this fact here. The question, I try to keep those little labels on there so I don't get confused. Remarkably easy to do under time pressure. Now, since they gave me that bit of algebra, I want to do everything I can with it. I call this pushing the question, which just means that I'm going to do everything I can with the information in the question. If I can write a logically equivalent question, so I'm looking for the value of M, is there anything I can get out of this equation that's going to mean exactly the same thing? In this case, sure. So we've got K minus M equals N. I'm going to add the M to both sides. So K equals N plus M. What I'm after, again, is that M. So I'm going to subtract N from both sides. K minus N equals M. Great. That's totally equivalent. Now I've got my second version of the question. If I can solve for M, I'm in business. If I can solve for K minus N. Now, doing this is going to make it so much easier to see the relevance of those answer choices. Very, very deliberate design feature of the exam. Don't ask me why they rate data sufficiency questions this way, but a very, very large percentage of questions, they're very clearly out to reward you. If you spend some time on the question first, process it, rewrite as many equivalent questions as you can, it's going to make it so much easier to see how these answer choices connect, going to save you a ton of time, going to save you a lot of errors in the long run if this becomes a habit. Now, to be clear, tons of data sufficiency questions. There's nothing you can do here. Read twice. That's it. On you go. There's no way to rewrite the question. Some questions, there are 4 or 5 ways to rewrite it. Do it every time. If they give you the chance, do it. Write as many ways as you can. Just make sure that they're logically equivalent. You also notice here I was very, very deliberate and systematic in my algebra. Very simple algebra. Could I have done it in my head? Sure. Would I do it in my head? No. Because it cost me almost nothing, just a few seconds to write these out. Helps me to make sure I don't make a careless error. Very, very easy to screw up a negative there. So I'm very, very careful to get it on paper. All right. So there's my questions. Let's get our little ADBCE widget going. And statement 1. Now, you might jump to the conclusion here. I'm looking for M. There's no M here, therefore not sufficient. But again, that's bad process. If you did your work here, we're looking for k minus n, then you can look at this and go, maybe I can manipulate it and get that k minus n. I'm going to start by adding 17 to both sides. 2k equals 2n plus 6, just adding the 17. Now I'm going to subtract the 2n. 2k minus 2n equals 6. Divide everything by 2. K minus n equals 3. And guess what, guys? That is sufficient. Question was asking me for m. There was no m in the answer choice, but I got something that's going to give me m. So I'm in business. Can cross out BCE since the answer is either A or D now. And then statement 2, same kind of thing, just a little bit of algebra here. I'm going to combine like terms first. Good first step whenever you do an algebra. I'm going to subtract 2m from both sides. Well, guess what? That makes my m's vanish. So I've got k equals n plus 3. I subtract the n from both sides. K minus n equals 3 again. It's exactly what I was looking for. K minus n, and that's sufficient. So my answer is not A, and it is D. All right. So again, nothing super fancy on the algebra, but typically we get probably 60% of people we throw this question at who are fairly new to the GMAT miss it. And again, it's all about your process, making sure that you're being totally systematic. Push the question, make sure you're keeping those statements separate, and give yourself a chance. It's easy to lunge at conclusions here and say, oh, no M, not sufficient. But good, do a little bit of work here. I'm not saying you have to do, there are questions where you don't necessarily have to do every little bit of algebra. Once you recognize it's sufficient, you can move on. But in this case, it's really, really, really easy to jump to conclusions when in reality, just a little bit of algebra and you've got it. All right, one more data sufficiency question, and then we'll finish up with a problem-solving question at the very end. All right, as always, hit that pause button if you need a little more time. Okay, again, I'm not trying to melt anybody's face off with super, super hard questions here. Just focus on process for data sufficiency. How do you keep your process nice and clean? Make sure you avoid those careless errors. Make sure you stay nice and efficient. Again, we're always going to read that question twice. Data sufficiency, really key thing. Let's plot the path forward, push the question as much as we can, see what we can do to make sense of it before we jump into the answer choices. All right, in this case, we're being asked if absolute value of x is equal to absolute value of y, what is the value of x plus y? The temptation here, as always, is just to barrel on through. Take a moment and go, all right, value of x plus y, there's my question. And now, can I make any sense of this? So as I said with the last question, if there's any way we can write an equivalent question, that's fantastic. Here, I might not be able to get quite to that level, but is there something I can do to help myself out as I look at the statements? Well, let's see. So if the absolute value of x is equal to the absolute value of y, well, it could be true that x equals y. When would that be true? Well, if they're the same sign. So for example, if x and y are both 4, or x and y are both -3, then they'd be equal to each other. That's going to be true only if the signs are the same. Well, but what if that's not true? What if they don't have the same sign? Then they're just going to be negations of each other, right? So you could have 4 and -4, for example, or 2 and -2. So if the signs are different, it's going to be the case that x is equal to -y. That's if the signs are different. Well, great. What can we do with that? We're being asked for the value of x plus y. Let's think through this just a tiny bit more. If they're equal, then fine, x plus y would be equal to 2x or 2y equivalently if the signs are the same and x is equal to y. But what if x is equal to -y? Well, that tells us that x plus y would have to be 0. Okay, that might be interesting. So I'm not arguing that we could necessarily rewrite this question exactly, but they've kind of given us a nice little thing in this question where we can take this and kind of go, let me keep this in mind, back of your head, front of the head, however you want to think about it. Keep that in mind. Maybe that helps us make some sense of these down the road. All right, I think that's about all we can do. We're looking for the value of x plus y. Maybe signs have something to do with this here. Let's jump in. All right, statement 1, if x is not equal to y, what does that tell us? Well, that tells us that the signs can't be the same in this case, since absolute value of x is equal to the absolute value of y. If those two values are the same, that's equivalent to saying that the signs are the same. So we are not in this world where x is equal to y. Instead, we have to be here, right? If x is not equal to y, then x has to be equal to -y. So where does that lead us? That means that x plus y has to be equal to 0 in this case. So if that's true, we can cross out B, C, E. Answer has to be either A or D. Cross all this out. Now notice it is remarkably easy here to just be dismissive and say, well, x is not equal to y. That doesn't tell me anything about the actual value. Fair enough. It doesn't tell us the value of x. It doesn't tell us the value of y. But if we've done our homework here and kind of milked everything we can out of the question itself, it tells us everything we need to know. If x isn't equal to y, one must be the negation of the other. You add those two together, you're just going to get 0. So statement 1 is sufficient. What about statement 2? Once again, really, really easy to be dismissive here and say, well, it doesn't tell me the value of x, doesn't tell me the value of y. I can't do anything with it. But you do know something here. You know that if the product is less than 0, has to be true that 1 is positive and 1 is negative. Could go in either direction, that x is positive, y is negative, or the other way around, x is negative, y is positive. Doesn't matter. In either case, we're back to this reality that x is equal to the negation of y. You add those two together once again, x plus y has to be equal to 0. So our answer here, once again, is D. All right. That's it for data sufficiency in this video. Just want to make sure that you're being super, super clean about your process. Always read your question twice, plot your path forward, do everything humanly possible with that question first, even if it doesn't give you anything super concrete. That little bit of work you do to think through the question before you jump into the statements, worth every second of time you spend there, helps us slice right through those answer choices really, really quickly. All right, we're going to finish up with one of my favorites. Nice problem-solving question. Okay, as always, hit the pause button if you need a little more time. But hopefully, if you saw what's going on here, you won't need that much time. Okay. So if you're like most people here, you read this question twice. Hopefully you read it twice and not just once. And you go, okay, following sums, which is greatest? And okay, it feels silly to read it twice, but it's worth the extra few seconds. Make sure I don't flip it around and decide to look for the smallest one. Go look for the biggest one. Now, if you're like most people, what you do here first time you see something like this is you go, ooh, that's a lot of common denominators I've got to do here. What's funny is teaching versions of this question over the years. I've seen so many people actually go ahead and try to do that, and it just drives you absolutely nuts. I mean, even the easiest one, which you could argue between D or E, but it's going to take you a minute to find an actual number. And that's the plotting that your path forward sort of deal where you go, okay, what are my options here? First option that's likely to come to your mind is, oh, I could start adding up these fractions. That's a terrible idea. Now, at that point, you've got two choices. Well, three choices, really. One is you could go ahead and start adding the fractions, and you're going to be here until next week. Terrible idea. The second thing you could do is say, okay, let me see if I can find a better way. And if you can't, that's when you acknowledge that you're overmatched here. Totally fine. No shame in it. Again, test is designed to find the level of question at which you get about half right, half wrong. So you're going to miss a bunch of questions on the GMAT or the executive assessment. So no shame in that. If you look at this and go, I don't know the shortcut, I don't know what to do here to make this faster, no problem. Guess, move on, spend that time somewhere else. Don't torture yourself trying to do a bunch of common denominators for this collection of 20 numbers. You're going to go nuts. Door number 3, hopefully most of you saw this, is, hey, wait a minute. They're not asking me for a number here exactly. I just need to compare these. As long as I can kind of acknowledge which one is going to be, and if I can find one that's bigger than the other, if I can say, for example, if I can say that B is bigger than D, well, then it can't be D. So what if I just go through and compare these? That sounds like a better path forward. So can I think of any better ideas? No, let me start comparing them, see if that gets me anywhere. So I'm going to start with the easier ones here personally, just because I don't necessarily want to deal with these funky, roots and exponents and all that stuff. So I might go, okay, can I do something with D and E? These are my nicest numbers to kind of make them easier to compare. Well, I notice right here, 1 minus a half. Well, that's just a half. So now I've got a half plus a third minus a fourth. Again, I'm going to try to avoid doing a lot of calculation if I can, but I'm looking for the biggest of these. The half is the same. The third is the same. We've got that minus a fourth here in D, plus a fourth plus a fifth in E. So E is bigger than D. D can't be our answer. I'm getting rid of D. Great. One down. Now, what else can I compare easily? Again, I'm trying to be nice to myself, trying to find things that are easy to deal with first. What about E versus, okay, we have something that looks like 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s denominator. How about with B? If I square those denominators, what happens? I make the denominator bigger. If I make the denominator bigger, I make the number smaller. So when I talk about step 3 here, checking each step as you go, that's one of those moments where I'm going to go, okay, wait a minute. Let me think about that. Is that really how it works? Yeah, of course. So bigger denominator, smaller number, smaller denominator, bigger number. So E is definitely bigger than B because B has the bigger denominators. So I'm going to get rid of B. Okay, same logic. Now I can look at C. C and B look pretty similar, but these are clearly going to be bigger in C than E. Denominators are bigger. Again, the numbers themselves are smaller. I'm going to give myself 3 or 4 more seconds, make sure I got that right. Seems silly, but spend that time, make sure you don't flip something around. So can't be C. E is clearly bigger. And now what about between A and E? Very similar logic. A, we've shrunk the denominators, which means we've made the numbers bigger compared to E. So smaller denominators, bigger numbers. So E is out and A is my answer. And that's it. Now, again, when we talk about good systematic approaches here, I'm going to read one more time. Did I want the greatest? Yes, I did. And I say, kind of use my human brain, make sure I didn't do something silly. A lot of moving parts here, a lot of numbers. Let me just make sure, double check and make sure this is reasonable. Does it seem reasonable that this is the biggest guy? Yeah, denominators are bigger here for sure. Bigger here, bigger here. All right, I feel pretty good about it. Give myself that last 5 second, 7 second, 15-second sanity check at the end. Always take that step. That's what saves you. All right. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. I know this is one of the least sexy quant topics you're ever going to see, where I'm talking about technique and process and, hey, go through these 4 steps, and nobody really wants to hear it. So kudos to you for making it this far. one last thought here is, as you're analyzing your own results, whether you're new to the GMAT, you're not new to the GMAT, I really, really, really want you to pay attention. The most important metric by far, you're working out of the official guides, you're doing worksheets from us, from some other company, you're doing practice tests, whatever it is you're doing, official practice tests, non-official. Most important thing, I just want you to look for those careless errors. So when you're reviewing your test, first thing I want you to notice, is there any questions that make you go, how the bleep did I miss that thing? Most important thing, pay special attention to those. It's really easy to blow them off and say, well, I knew the math under there, so I'm okay next time. Those are the most important things to fix. If you fix those, I promise your score is going to stabilize and it's going to go up. And again, we've seen some pretty lousy math students, and they wouldn't mind me saying that, who've gotten 47s on the GMAT Quant or 12s on the EA Quant. Not necessarily spectacular at math, but spectacular execution, systematic, go through these steps, pick your battles wisely, let things go if you're overmatched, and just make sure you never beat yourself. Let the test beat you, miss the hard questions, and say, good job, GMAT, you got me on this one. And the ones that are in your wheelhouse, make sure you're being super, 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 super systematic. All right. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time.